So right now we are going to move on to Visual Studio and we are going to create new project using the Integration Service project. That's SSIS, SQL Server Integration Services. In Visual Studio, you can identify it as Integration Service project. So I'll click on that and go to next. Now I have to give a name to my project. I'm going to call it COVID-19 ETL. Okay. I need to save this in my C drive. So I'm just gonna navigate to my C drive and save it in this folder. Now I can click on create and this begins my ETL creation process. This is how SSIS looks like, and you can perform several activities with this SSIS. However, all or most of my explanations will be based on the tags that I'll be using for my data flow and for my ETL process. Here on this page, we have the Solution Explorer. That's where you can see the name of my project, and also I can create connections to my data source and also to my destination using this connection manager. I can create new, or I can create connection manager on the fly when I'm extracting my data or loading my data. For the purpose of this video, I prefer to create my connections on the fly so I can better explain it to you. Alright, we use SSIS package to contain all of our activities that will migrate our data into SQL Server. So here I'm going to rename this one to COVID-19 underscore staging underscore ETL. Yes, to all. So this first package will host all of our activities that will extract our data from the source into our staging environment. Alright, so at this stage, I'm going to grab the data flow tags. So if you click at tags and you want to understand what it does, you can come down here and read more about it. So this data flow tags helps us to move data between sources and destination while transforming and cleaning the data. Isn't that cool? That is essentially ETL. So if you use this data flow tags, it allows you to extract data, transform it, and load it. So if you double click on this data flow here, you see that these are the activities that you can perform in there. You have favorite that is most frequently used and has been tagged up here for you to use without any issues. And we have common transformations that you can apply to your data. There is other transformations as well that you can use to clean or transform your data. And we have sources and destination. So for instance, right now I want to move my Excel document into my staging environment, which is destined to be in my SQL Server. So I can go to the sources section and select Excel because I know my data is in an Excel file and place it on this window, and I can rename it by double clicking on it or right clicking to rename it. So I'll call this extract COVID data. Okay, so once I double click on this Excel tags, if I had already created a connection, I could have picked it up from here, but because I did not have it, I'd have to put new. So this new will ask me to browse to my file location and grab the data. So I'll browse to my file location, which is in my document, and navigate there to grab the Excel document. I'll click on OK once it's loaded. This is a table, so I will leave this option as it is. And the name of this sheet, I have several different sheets on this document, but the one that I want is this one. So I'll go back to my Visual Studio. and then I'll click on this drop down arrow beside name of file or sheet. So when I click on this drop down arrow, I get to select my Excel sheet, which is COVID-19 data. And then I'll go to the left side of this window and click on columns. So these are all of the columns within my Excel sheet. I'll go back to the connection manager and preview the data in there. So this is a preview of all of the data I have in my Excel sheet, and that also looks good. So I'll close this window and click on OK. Now that I have brought in my data, here I would have to set the data types of all of my data to ensure that it is consistent. So I can do that by going to Show Advanced Editor. So here in my Advanced Editor window, I want to go to Input and Output Properties, Excel Source, Output Columns, and I want to change all of my data types for the columns one by one. So here I have proof ID, which I know to be an integer. However, it's been set to a float. If I click on this drop down arrow, I get to select SSIS own version of integer, which is DTI4. Yeah, this one. Sorry, this is a type of an integer. So I'll click on this drop down arrow and look for DTI4 once again. Alright, region name is a string, so I'll leave it as it is. However, I'll change the length to 50. Of EW, which stands for episode week, is an integer. So I'll change this data type. And this is also an integer. This is an integer. It looks as if all integers have been changed to float, so that can help me also to move faster. Once I see a float, I know that it's an integer. This is a string, that's good. And this looks like an integer. That's a string. That's an integer. That's a string. And that's an integer. It's an integer. And then integer. This is a string. This is an integer. And that's a string. I'll change the string length to 5 because it only has 3 words in it. This is an integer. Integer. There we go. Integer. And an integer. And I'm just gonna double check all of them again. This is a string. Just gonna change this to 100. It's an integer. Integer. ASM. I'll change the string length to 20. Integer occupation, I'll change this to 50. Integer string AGR is just the year group, so I'll change this to 20. GDR stands for the gender. I'll make this M. Okay, so with this, I have changed all the data types and the string length of the data types. So here you can look at the column mapping and see that all of our source Excel columns are mapped onto the right columns down here as well. And these are the properties of all the records that we've just extracted from Excel and the connection that we created. So with this, I'll click on OK, and we have a little warning here that says that RSV with length 155 will be truncated. Let me double check the string length of RSV. I'll change the string length to 15. From the business requirement, I need to rename the columns and also introduce the date and transformation fields. First is for us to rename the columns. I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to do it in the destination tags so that once it's going, it picks that name. What I can do now is to add the transformation, which is adding 2 new fields. So I can do that by using this tags called the derived column. I'll place it on my canvas and move the precedence arrow to connect to it. I need to configure this tags, so I'll double click on it, and what I want to do is to introduce 2 columns, and I'm going to call them that, and the other one is, let me double check the names again, TRM transmission. I have the code here, but I do not have the description field here. Okay, so it's a derived column, so I'm gonna add as a new column. And the expression that I need to put is that if the date field is equal to 1, then give me yes. Else, if the date field is equal to 2, then it's a no. Else, not stated. Once your code or expression is validated, SSIS gives you the data type. If the code is wrong, it gets shaded in red. For instance, if I remove this column, it turns to red because there is something wrong with my code. So I'm just gonna put it back just to let you know that if the code is wrong, SSIS will tell you. Now, for me to derive the transmission, I'm going to say that if this transmission code is equal to 1, then else, if transmission code is equal to 2, then else not stated. There's something wrong with the code right now. So I need to debug it, and I think I need to put question mark here. Is equal to 1, and this else. The column is for else 2, then okay. So this has been validated for me. That's perfect. Alright. So I'll click on OK here, and then I need to put my destination. So using the OLADB destination, this loads into an OLADB compliant relational database such as SQL Server. So I'm just going to set a precedence to move on to this destination. SQL Server destination. So here I'm just going to configure it to load my data into SQL Server, and I'm going to create a new connection. I already have my connection here. Now let me double check if I have any table there to load this data into. So moving on to SQL Server, I will click on the connect to connect to my SQL Server. I'll go to databases. That database no longer exists. I probably might have created it when I was testing the data. So in order for me to create a database and the schema all over again, I have saved the queries in my folder. So I'll just go ahead and navigate to my file location and open. So I'm just gonna create a database called COVID-19 and set my database to the COVID-19 database. So for instance, when I create this database, I'll click on execute. And if I want to change to make sure that I'm working in this COVID-19 database, I'm going to execute this command. Oh, alright, so I misnamed it here, so I'm just going to use database, and then within this COVID-19 database, I'm going to create schema ETW and also create schema staging. Execute. Alright, so I would refresh this database and move back into my Visual Studio. I'm going to create a new connection to my database. I'll click on new and click on this drop down arrow. This is the server I'm working in. So I'll choose that. Windows authentication is fine by me. If your business requires otherwise, you can click on this drop down arrow and select the authentication mode you want. The database that I just created is called COVID-19, and then I'll test my connection. Once it succeeds, I'll click on OK and OK again here, and OK to close it. Now I'm going to either select a table from my database, which I do not have because I've not executed any create table syntax in that database. So I can either create a table in the database and then choose that table from this drop down arrow, or I can click on this new button to create a table on the fly within SSIS. That's what I'm going to do in this instance. And I'm just going to rename my table to staging COVID-19. It's going to have all of my columns. So with this, I'll click on OK. So I can click on this drop down arrow to select it. Alright. Now moving on to the mapping, I want to make sure that all of the columns within my Excel sheet that's are mapped onto the right columns in my SQL database, and that looks fine. So I'll click on OK. I'm going back to my control flow and right click on it and click on execute. Now it is loading my data into SQL Server. Now, as you can see, my data has been successfully loaded into my staging environment. Alright, so let's move on to SQL Server and see if we can find that record in the table. So here is the table, so I'm just gonna select all records from the table and execute. Oops, I didn't select all of the statement. So execute, and there we have it. This record is over 1 million and they've all been loaded in just a blink of an eye. Isn't that awesome? So guys, this is how to load data into the staging environment. The next step of our tutorial is to create an enterprise data warehouse from our staging environment, and we are going to design a star schema. We're going to do that all using SSIS and SQL Server. The first thing we want to do is to create our dimension tables. So I have written down the queries to create the table, so I'll just go ahead and execute.